Do you enjoy, because you're a smart guy, do you enjoy being stupid?
Oh, yeah, I love being stupid. When we were writing Python, that was the word we always used, silly.
Yeah.
We loved it when it was silly, sometimes when it was naughty.
Few films are as endlessly quoted or as joyfully absurd as Monty Python and the Holy Grail. For decades, fans thought they had it all figured out. The jokes, the chaos, the genius behind the madness. Yet, John Cleese recently dropped a revelation that stunned even die-hard followers. It turns out the film hides a truth most viewers completely overlooked. And once you hear it, the Holy Grail suddenly looks a little different. What they never told you about Monty Python. When John Cleese finally spoke openly about Monty Python and the Holy Grail, most fans expected more of the usual behind-the-scenes anecdotes. Gripes about the cold Scottish weather, or how the infamous coconuts replaced horses because of budget cuts. But instead, Cleese revealed something that went far deeper. Most viewers had completely misunderstood what the Pythons were really doing with the film. It wasn't just parody, he insisted. It was an experiment in dismantling storytelling itself. Cleese admitted that, from the beginning, the group had no interest in giving audiences a neat plot, a satisfying ending, or even a clear point. To them, the very idea of a traditional narrative was the joke. Knights questing for the Holy Grail? Sure, that was the framework. But the real comedy, he explained, was in how they sabotaged their own story at every turn, pulling away just when the plot looked like it might make sense. Fans had always laughed at the randomness, the killer rabbit, the knights who say knee, the abrupt police intervention at the finale, but many missed the bigger picture. Cleese revealed that the chaos wasn't chaos at all. It was deliberate. They wanted to mock the audience's expectations, to poke fun at the idea that a movie must deliver a logical journey. In Cleese's words, "We were laughing at the very structure of storytelling." This revelation hit fans differently. Some realized, maybe for the first time, that the film's weirdness wasn't just silliness for its own sake. It was Monty Python holding up a mirror to the rules of cinema and gleefully smashing them apart. Others admitted it made them love the film even more, because now they could see the genius hidden beneath the absurdity. Suddenly, all those moments that seemed like random nonsense carried a sharper edge. Cleese's candor reframed Monty Python and the Holy Grail not as a collection of disjointed skits stitched together, but as a deliberate act of comedic rebellion. And for many fans, that was the revelation they never saw coming. Could it be that Monty Python's greatest laughs came from mistakes? Let's dwell on that for a bit. Comedy by accident. If there was one thing John Cleese wanted people to know about Monty Python and the Holy Grail, it was that the writing process was far from the carefully orchestrated plan fans often imagine. In fact, Cleese admitted it was messy, frustrating, and often downright chaotic. The group wasn't sitting around a polished writer's table with a master outline. Instead, it was a clash of egos, a storm of half-baked ideas, and long stretches of staring at one another in silence until someone blurted out something ridiculous. Cleese described it almost like a battlefield. Each Python had his own sense of humor, and they didn't always align. Cleese leaned toward sharp satire and biting wit. Michael Palin liked silliness and warmth. Terry Jones had a deep love of history and structure. Eric Idle was obsessed with wordplay. Graham Chapman, Cleese's writing partner, could bring brilliance but also unpredictability. Put them together, and sparks flew constantly. Out of those sparks, though, came the bizarre, unforgettable energy of Holy Grail. One of Cleese's most surprising admissions was how many jokes people think of as genius were, in reality, born from desperation. When they were stuck, Someone would throw out the most absurd suggestion possible, often as a joke within the writer's room. And sometimes that throwaway line ended up in the script. The Killer Rabbit of Kerbanog, for example, started as nothing more than a sarcastic way to fill space. Yet once the group visualized it, a tiny, fluffy rabbit tearing men to pieces, they couldn't stop laughing. What was once filler became one of the film's most iconic sequences. The process was far from harmonious. Cleese openly admitted he often grew impatient with the meandering discussions. He liked efficiency and structure, but the Pythons thrived on tangents. He recalled sitting in rooms where an hour-long debate about one word turned into a running gag and that nobody outside the group would ever understand. At times, he thought the project was doomed because there seemed to be no focus. But strangely enough, that lack of focus became the very DNA of the film. Accidents piled on top of accidents. The Knights who say Nice
Who are you?
We are the Knights who say...
scene, which still confuses and delights viewers, wasn't planned as some grand commentary. It came from a silly sound someone made during rehearsal. Instead of discarding it, they built an entire sequence around it. In Cleese's view, that was the beauty of Monty Python. They never threw away something just because it didn't make sense. In fact, nonsense was often the point. Looking back, Cleese admitted that he sometimes resented the chaos in the writing room. But with distance, he could see how essential it was. The brilliance of Holy Grail didn't come from neatness or control. It came from surrendering to madness. Comedy wasn't just written. It was stumbled upon, discovered in the middle of arguments, and shaped by sheer accident. And in Cleese's eyes, that's what made the final product so enduring. Money was tight, so was the humor. If you've ever wondered why Monty Python and the Holy Grail looks like it was shot on a shoestring budget, that's because it absolutely was. John Cleese has never shied away from admitting how poor the production really was. In fact, he's often joked that the film's greatest miracle wasn't the comedy, it was that it got made at all. Money was scarce. Investors were skeptical. And at times, the group had no idea if the project would even reach completion. The funding story has almost become legend. Traditional studios turned them down flat. To executives, Monty Python was too weird, too niche, and far too risky. Who would pay to watch a film about knights that sounded more like a sketch show than a movie? When the big names in Hollywood passed, the Pythons turned to an unlikely source of support. Rock stars. Bands like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, flush with success, chipped in because they were fans of Monty Python's surreal television work. George Harrison also played a role in later Python projects. But for Holy Grail, it was really the music industry that kept the cameras rolling. Without that strange mix of comedy and rock and roll, the movie might have died before the first coconut was cracked. But even with those contributions, the budget was tiny. Castles had to be borrowed, reused, and sometimes doubled up in the script to disguise the fact that there weren't enough of them. Costumes were basic, props were cheap, and production design often relied on trickery rather than money. And then came the coconuts, the gag that would become one of the film's most iconic. Most fans assumed the coconuts were a stroke of comedic genius, a surreal jab at cinematic expectations. But Cleese confessed that the gag was born almost entirely out of necessity. The team couldn't afford horses. Horses meant wranglers, stables, trainers, and a budget they simply didn't have. Faced with that obstacle, they turned it into a joke. The idea of actors galloping around on foot while assistants clacked coconuts together was absurd, cheap, and effective. What started as a financial workaround became one of the film's defining features, perfectly marrying absurdity with creativity. Cleese later reflected, that the money problems actually sharpened their humor. When you don't have cash to throw at a problem, you have to solve it with imagination. And that's exactly what Monty Python thrived on. Every limitation became an opportunity. Instead of a polished epic, they created a scrappy, anarchic comedy that still looked unlike anything else at the time. The low-budget roughness gave the film a homemade charm, one that fit perfectly with the group's irreverent style. He also admitted that the lack of money sometimes created real tension. Shooting in cold, muddy fields while dressed in thin medieval costumes wasn't glamorous, and the cast grumbled. But in hindsight, Cleese saw it as almost poetic. The discomfort bled into the humor, giving the performances a raw, desperate energy. The knights didn't look heroic. They looked ridiculous, which was exactly the point. For Cleese, the revelation wasn't just that they made comedy under pressure. It was that the pressure itself made the comedy better. The coconuts, the castles, even the scrappy costumes all reminded audiences that the film wasn't trying to be a glossy blockbuster. It was a parody stitched together with wit, nerve, and just enough money to keep the cameras running. And somehow, that patchwork creation became a comedy classic. Question, was it all laughs or were there battles behind the scenes? Listen to this revelation. The cast didn't always get along. When audiences watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail, what they see looks effortless. A group of brilliant comedians bouncing off one another with perfect timing, each character slotting into place like pieces of a puzzle. But according to John Cleese, that seamlessness was often an illusion. Behind the scenes, the cast didn't always get along, and the creative process was full of arguments, bruised egos, and more than a little tension. Cleese has often described Monty Python as a family, but like any family, it came with rivalries and grudges. He was blunt about it. We didn't always like each other. That honesty shocked some fans who assumed the group's chemistry on screen must have carried over into real life. In truth, the very differences that made their comedy sparkle also made collaboration a struggle. Cleese was the perfectionist, often wanting sketches tightened and polished. Terry Jones, by contrast, was more free-flowing, willing to embrace excess and indulgence. Eric Idle leaned into clever wordplay, sometimes at the expense of structure. Graham Chapman, Cleese's longtime writing partner, could be brilliant but unpredictable, especially as his drinking habits worsened during the period. It wasn't that they hated each other, far from it, but their clashing visions made working together exhausting at times. Cleese confessed that he sometimes left writing sessions in frustration, convinced that nothing good would come out of the bickering. And yet, paradoxically, it was exactly those arguments that produced the weird alchemy of Holy Grail. The friction forced them to push harder, to fight for their ideas, and to refine jokes until they were sharp enough to survive the group's relentless criticism. One example Cleese gave was the infamous Black Knight scene. At first, the group wasn't sure it would work. Some thought it was too violent, others thought it was too silly, and still others worried it dragged on. They argued endlessly over how far to push the joke. Should the knight lose an arm and quit, or keep fighting? Should the blood spurts be exaggerated or subtle? In the end, the scene became a masterpiece of escalating absurdity precisely because each member pushed for their version until they struck the right balance. Without the arguments, Cleese admitted, it might have been cut altogether. But the tension wasn't limited to writing. On set, fatigue and miserable conditions sometimes made tempers flare. Imagine trudging through freezing Scottish mud, wearing heavy armor costumes that chafed, only to spend hours repeating the same absurd lines while your breath fogged in the cold air. It's no surprise that not every day was full of laughter. Cleese remembered moments where cast members snapped at one another, frustrated by the discomfort and the slow pace of shooting. And yet, when the cameras rolled, something magical happened. Whatever disagreements they had, the Pythons delivered. The tension, in a strange way, heightened the performances. Their bickering fed into the characters' absurd squabbles, making the comedy feel real. Watching King Arthur's knights argue over the silliest things mirrored the creative clashes behind the curtain. Cleese admitted that, at the time, he sometimes worried the group wouldn't survive their own battles. But in hindsight, he recognized the paradox. The very conflicts that nearly tore them apart also made their comedy sharper, stranger, and unforgettable. Monty Python wasn't about harmony, it was about collision. And the Holy Grail was the proof that even creative chaos could become cinematic gold. Filming was a nightmare. For all the laughs Monty Python and the Holy Grail gave to audiences, John Cleese never sugarcoated how miserable the actual filming was. In interviews, he's joked that the hardest part wasn't the comedy, it was surviving the Scottish weather. Behind the slapstick and surrealism lay a production that often felt more like an endurance test than a film shoot. The crew had chosen Scotland because of its authentic medieval landscapes and castles, but authenticity came at a price. Relentless rain, bone-chilling wind, and mud that seemed determined to swallow everything whole. The cast would trudge across soggy fields in heavy costumes, their chainmail made not from real metal, but from wool dyed silver. It looked convincing on camera, but when wet, the material clung to their skin like a freezing second layer. Cleese recalled standing around shivering between takes, teeth chattering, wondering why on earth he had agreed to make a film about knights when he could have been in a warm studio instead. The castles weren't much better. Because of the budget, they had limited access and had to reuse the same locations for different scenes. That meant long hours of setting up and tearing down equipment, often in drafty, stone-cold halls, where even lighting a fire wasn't an option. The discomfort was so real that at times it bled into the performances. Characters who looked miserable on screen weren't just acting, they were miserable. Then there were the practical headaches. Horses were unaffordable, so actors had to gallop around on foot, while assistants clacked coconut shells together. That solved one problem but created another. Running through mud in armor was exhausting, and many takes ended with knights slipping and tumbling face first into the muck. Cleese, who played several roles, admitted that the physical comedy often came less from careful choreography and more from genuine accidents captured on film. The weather also wreaked havoc on the schedule. Days were lost to torrential rain. Equipment broke down, roads flooded, and morale dropped. Cleese remembered moments where the cast and crew simply sat around, waiting for the skies to clear, knowing full well that the budget couldn't afford delays. The frustration was palpable. At times, it felt like the film was cursed. Yet, in hindsight, Cleese admitted that the misery almost worked in their favor. The bleakness of the environment gave the film an authentic, gritty feel that polished productions could never replicate. The mud, the cold, the dreary skies, they became part of the film's DNA, perfectly contrasting with the absurdity of the jokes. The knights looked weary and ridiculous, which only amplified the comedy. Instead of glamorous heroes, they resembled exhausted, half-frozen fools stumbling through a farce of history. It also bonded the cast, in its own strange way. Shared suffering has a way of creating camaraderie. They might have bickered in the writing room, but on location, huddled together in the Scottish chill, they endured as a team. Looking back, Cleese described it as both the worst and best experience of his career. It was miserable in the moment, but it gave birth to a film that still makes people laugh nearly 50 years later. So when fans rewatch the Holy Grail and marvel at the silliness, they might not realize that behind those laughs were frozen toes, soaked costumes, and actors silently cursing the rain. For Cleese, that irony was perfect. The harder it was to make, the funnier it turned out to be. The jokes within jokes. One of the most surprising things John Cleese admitted about Monty Python and the Holy Grail is that, while the humor looks random and chaotic, much of it was layered with inside jokes, hidden digs, and parodies that many fans never fully noticed. On the surface, you've got knights running around shouting nonsense, a killer rabbit, and endless coconut clopping. But beneath that absurdity, Cleese explained, the film was full of winks to history, religion, politics, and even the act of comedy itself. Take the endless mocking of authority figures. King Arthur, who should have been a grand and noble leader, is reduced to a man no one takes seriously. Dismissed by peasants who debate the legitimacy of kingship with modern political jargon. Cleese revealed that this wasn't just silliness, it was their way of skewering the very idea of unquestioned power. The Monty Python crew were fascinated by how easily history is romanticized, and they wanted to rip away that veneer to show how ridiculous it looked when placed under a comedic microscope. Then there's the religious parody. The monks who march around chanting in Latin and smacking themselves with boards might look like pure slapstick, but Cleese noted that it was also a jab at ritual for ritual's sake. They wanted to lampoon the blind repetition of tradition without purpose, exposing the absurdity by exaggerating it until it became laughable. Even the film's infamous abrupt ending, where the police suddenly arrive and shut everything down, wasn't random. Cleese admitted that it was a giant meta-joke on storytelling itself, deliberately undercutting audience expectations. For years, people debated whether it meant something deeper, but Cleese confessed it was mainly the Pythons thumbing their noses at the very idea of a proper ending. In other words, the punchline was that there was no punchline. But Cleese also pointed out that many of the gags were jokes within jokes, designed to hit different audiences in different ways. Kids could laugh at the silliness of a rabbit mauling armored knights, while adults might notice the satire about myths and legends being inflated to absurd proportions. Someone steeped in history might catch the political commentary, while a casual viewer could enjoy the sheer ridiculousness without needing the deeper layer. That's why the film, he argued, had such staying power. It offered something for everyone, whether they realized it or not. Perhaps the cleverest part, Cleese revealed, was that the Pythons were also mocking themselves. They knew they were a comedy troupe trying to make a film without enough money, structure, or experience. So instead of pretending otherwise, they leaned into the chaos. The constant breaking of the fourth wall, the deliberate undercutting of drama, the awkward pacing, all of it was their way of laughing at the very idea of making a serious film. It was comedy cannibalizing itself, and audiences didn't even realize they were part of the experiment. The jokes landed, the characters became legends, but the ending? That's where things get truly strange, the ending that still baffles fans. Even after nearly 50 years, the ending of Monty Python and the Holy Grail continues to confuse first-time viewers. Just when it seems like the film is building to some epic showdown, King Arthur assembling his knights, preparing to storm the French castle, the entire story screeches to a halt. Police cars pull up, Arthur is arrested, and the movie simply cuts to black. No climactic battle, no triumphant discovery of the Grail, just abrupt nonsense. For decades, fans debated what it meant. John Cleese finally explained, it didn't mean anything in the way people wanted it to. The ending wasn't a grand philosophical statement about futility, Nor was it a coded message about society. It was simply a massive prank on the audience. According to Cleese, the Pythons thought it would be hilarious to deny viewers the satisfaction of a proper conclusion. After all, comedies usually wrapped things up neatly, but Monty Python had no interest in playing by those rules. They wanted to mock the very idea of endings. The decision didn't come easily, though. Cleese admitted the group went back and forth for weeks, unable to settle on how to finish the movie. Every idea felt wrong. A traditional ending seemed boring. A big battle was impossible with their budget. Finding the Grail felt too obvious. Out of frustration, they landed on the most anti-ending they could imagine, having the film collapse in on itself, with modern-day police breaking the illusion. The punchline was that there was no punchline. At first, even some of the Pythons worried audiences would revolt. And in a way, they did. Early screenings left people baffled, with some viewers convinced the projector had broken. Others were annoyed that all the build-up led to nothing. But over time, the ending became part of the movie's legend. Fans began to see it not as a mistake, but as the ultimate Monty Python gag, an act of comedic sabotage so audacious it could only have been intentional. Cleese confessed he was delighted by the outrage. To him, the fact that audiences argued over it for decades proved the joke had worked. By refusing to deliver a conventional resolution, they forced viewers to confront how conditioned they were to expect one. It was, in his words, a joke on storytelling itself. The absurdity of knights arrested by police was just the cherry on top. And perhaps that's why the ending still resonates. It's funny, yes, but it also feels like a reminder that Monty Python never played by the rules. Where other films gave audiences closure, Holy Grail pulled the rug out and left them sitting in the dark, laughing and scratching their heads. For Cleese, that was the perfect finish. Frustrating, bold, and unforgettable. What Cleese really thinks of the film now. Decades after its release, you might expect John Cleese to look back at Monty Python and the Holy Grail with nothing but pride. After all, it's become a cultural phenomenon, quoted endlessly, taught in film courses, and adored by generations of fans. But Cleese's reflections are more complicated than simple nostalgia. In true Python fashion, his feelings about the movie are a mix of admiration, bemusement, and a touch of exasperation. Cleese has admitted, somewhat surprisingly, that he never thought Holy Grail would have such a long life. At the time of filming, the group was exhausted. The production was chaotic, and nobody knew if it would even work. He recalled watching the first rough cut and thinking it felt disjointed, like a collection of sketches strung together with a flimsy thread. To him, it wasn't polished enough to be considered a proper film. He was proud of individual moments, like the Black Knight scene or the killer rabbit, but wasn't convinced the whole thing held together. Over the years, though, his perspective shifted. Seeing audiences laugh, quote, and celebrate the film gave him a new appreciation for what they'd created. He confessed that some jokes he once thought were too silly had grown on him, especially as fans embraced them with enthusiasm. The knee scene, for example, was one he considered almost too ridiculous, but watching how it became a universal inside joke made him recognize its strange brilliance. At the same time, Cleese remains his own harshest critic. He has said that parts of the film drag, that some sketches don't quite land, and that the pacing feels uneven. If he could redo it today, he claims, he'd cut certain scenes entirely. Yet, he also acknowledges that the film's imperfections are part of its charm. If it had been smoother, he once mused, it wouldn't have been us. The rough edges, the abrupt cuts, the randomness, they all became part of Monty Python's signature style. Cleese also seemed genuinely surprised by the film's influence on modern comedy. He never imagined that phrases like "it's just a flesh wound" or "knee" would still be quoted decades later, or that the coconut gag would become shorthand for absurdity itself. To him, these were throwaway jokes, things they put in because they made the group laugh at the time. Watching them evolve into cultural touchstones has been both flattering and surreal. Perhaps the most revealing thing Cleese has said is that he doesn't see Holy Grail as perfect or even as Monty Python's best work. He often points to Life of Brian as their more accomplished film, with tighter writing and a stronger satirical backbone. But when it comes to sheer impact, he admits Holy Grail has no rival. It's the film that refuses to die, endlessly rediscovered by new generations. So what does Cleese really think of it now? In his own words, "It was a mess, but a glorious mess." He laughs at its flaws, marvels at its success, and accepts that, whether he likes it or not, Monty Python and the Holy Grail will always be the film that defines him in the eyes of millions. And truth be told, he seems more than a little proud of that. The human behind the comedy. It's easy to think of John Cleese only as the tall, sharp-tongued comedian who delivered some of Monty Python's funniest lines. But when you listen to him reflect on the Holy Grail, you see more than just a performer. You see the human being behind the comedy. Cleese has often said that making people laugh was never just about entertainment for him. It was about exploring absurdity, poking at authority, and reminding people not to take the world or themselves too seriously. What fans often forget is how much work went into pulling off the chaos. Cleese wasn't just improvising lines. He was meticulously shaping characters, tweaking timing, and pouring himself into performances that felt effortless, but were anything but. Beneath the silliness of the Black Knight or the French Taunter was a performer obsessed with rhythm, wit, and delivery. His comedic genius wasn't luck, it was craft. At the same time, Cleese has always been candid about his frustrations, both with himself and with the creative process. He's admitted he can be difficult, perfectionist, even prickly at times. Yet those very traits fueled the ambition that made Monty Python's humor so distinctive. What shines through is that Cleese, for all his sharp edges, genuinely cared about comedy's ability to connect people. When fans approach him decades later with tears in their eyes, thanking him for giving them joy during dark times, he doesn't brush it off. He acknowledges that maybe, just maybe, all the chaos was worth it. Cleese isn't just a comedian, he's a reminder that behind every laugh is a human being wrestling with doubt, hope, and the strange need to leave something behind that will outlast them. For Cleese, Monty Python and the Holy Grail became that legacy, whether he planned it or not. Have you seen the film yet? Share us your thoughts about it. And if you liked this video, there's more in this channel, so hit subscribe now.